as well as on the paper that is in your hand. And for our friends from the press, we have a press event with Mr. Yo later on in room 201 at 12:30. With that, I'd like to introduce the Asia Pacific Forward Forum organizer and our moderator for today's event, Professor管中閔. Professor Guan is an economist specializes in econometric theory and empirical research. From 2012 to 2015, he has been appointed to several ministerial positions in the Executive Yuan. Professor Guan was elected president of the National Taiwan University in 2018 and began serving his term in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Professor Guan to the stage.
Good morning, distinguished speakers and guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the very first event of the Asia Pacific Forward Forum. And thank you for joining us today. At the beginning, I would like to share with you the reasons that inspired us to organize this forum. We all know the Asia Pacific region has undergone significant changes since the end of World War II, experienced rapid economic development and significant transformation in political system and social structures. I think it sounds better. Okay, the Asia Pacific region has undergone significant change since the end of World War II, experiencing rapid economic development and a significant transformation in political systems and the social structures. Taiwan is, of course, a leading example or the epitome of this evolution. With the accelerated rise of mainland China in recent years, the relationship between two superpowers in this region, the US and the mainland China, has shifted from the early years of mutual cooperation to escalating rivalry among technology, military, and politics. Given the historically entwined and the complex relationship between these three worlds, Taiwan, mainland China, and the US, and the increasingly strained dynamics between the latter two countries, Taiwan now not only holds a pivotal position between these two superpowers, but also involuntarily became a sort of pressure point, which many fear that this may become a setting of some incoming conflict. So the goal of this forum is to share the perspective of the experts and the scholars overseas, and from which to encourage everyone in Taiwan to think about Taiwan's future approach to international environment, especially the cross-strait relations, through broader and more forward-looking lenses. The forum's name in Chinese, we'll call this 千里论坛. So the name in Chinese intentionally translates to 1,000 miles, signifies that only by rising above and beyond our preconceived notions can we see a more long-term and sustainable future. Like we learned, 欲穷千里目, 我们不要更上一层楼. So the forum is a collaborative initiative created by徐宗懋先生and myself. We are very honored to have Mr. George Ye, Yang Rongwen先生as the forum's very first keynote speaker. And we are grateful for the panelists, the former minister, Mr. David Lin, 林永乐前部长, and also Professor Philip Xu 徐斯勤教授。We especially want to thank the Fair Winds Foundation 长风文教基金会董事长江宜桦先生也在座。KTD Foundation for Development of Science and Technology 李国鼎科技发展基金会董事长王博元也在这里，谢谢。And the Monty-J Science and Technology Association of Taiwan 台湾玉山科技协会。协会的理事长他今天因为有事没有办法亲自出席。We thank those organizations for co-hosting this forum. Last but not least, we also thank MaiCoin, 徐宗懋图文馆 and the Association of Foreign Relations, 的对外关系协会 and the National Taiwan University Creator Center for co-hosting this forum. Without their support, this event would not have been possible. Thank you again, everyone, for your attendance and participation. And we wish today's forum to be a great success and providing with valuable insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Guan. And now, please welcome former Vice President Vincent Hsu to the stage with this round of applause.
Guest speaker, Mr. Joe and Mrs. Hsu, distinguished guests from Singapore, 马总统，各位贵宾，各位好朋友，大家早安，大家好 ，Good morning。我很高兴在这里向大家介绍。今天亚太千里论坛的主讲人，也是我超过30年的老朋友杨荣文先生 ，Mr. George 拥有丰富的而精彩的学经历，也是新加坡著名的外交家与政治家。他在英国剑桥大学及美国哈佛大学取得学术及硕士学位，并且从新加坡武装部队开始了他的政府服务的生涯，曾经担任过新加坡武装部队参谋长，并且兼联合行动及策划师长。就随后当选国会议员，并且先后被委任为各个部会的政务部长及部长。政务部长就是 political minister。那么他在2004到2011年，担任新加坡的外交部长期间，表现特别的优异，而受人所注目。就离开政坛以后，凭借着他在外交方面的广泛经验，以及他对世界局势和地缘政治敏锐的洞察力，迅速的成为知名的国际政经情势的专家，而广为各界所推崇。我初次认识 George 是在1991年韩国汉城，现在叫首尔的 APEC 会议上。那么第二年，我们又在泰国曼谷的 APEC 会议见面。记得会议的第一天，由于George他的巧妙的安排，让我也跟中国的会议中的代表李南清先生并邻而坐， 当时大陆跟我们都在争取加入 GATT， 也就是后来的 WTO 的前身，所以我们的话题自然就环绕着贸易谈判。我记得当时李南清先生问我要怎么样做好贸易谈判，我强调一定要找一个相关贸易的专才，才能够跟谈判对手 speaking the same language。后来中国大陆呢，果然这世贸的谈判工作就从外交部转到具有多年经贸工作的经贸部的副部长龙永图先生负责。我因此呢，也跟李南清先生就建立了友谊。1990年代，两岸关系仍然非常紧张，双方对参与国际活动和国际组织都非常的谨慎跟小心。然而，当时我和李南清先生谈话时，我们双方都很自然，而且坦诚。或许是因为当时建立了一些的互信，中国大陆呢，并没有在我们争取 WTO 的过程中刻意的杯葛。双方也就分别在2001年和2002年初都成为 WTO 的会员。这个故事总是提醒我，先放下成见，相互沟通，才能够建立互信，也才可能为未来找到新的机会、新的出路。今天George将阐述他对两岸关系的看法跟建议。两岸关系无疑是台湾现在最敏感，也是民众最关心的议题。然而，许多人在讨论和深思两岸关系的时候，都往往又以成见，没有办法摆脱过去特定的思维的框限，以至于大家都针锋相对，机不相能。这样的争执实在无助于我们思考两岸关系的应对之道。我诚挚的盼望George今天的演讲能带给我们不一样的观点跟启发，如同刚刚管校长他在致辞中所说的，不一样的观点将有助于我们跳脱目前既有思维的羁绊，从不同的角度和不同的高度，重新来审视台湾如何走向更长远的未来。我再度的欢迎George不远千里来到千里论坛。George, stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Zhao. Now let's put our hands together for Mr. George Yeo.
Distinguished guests, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. First, I thank Vice President Vincent Hsu for your kind words and your very warm recollection of our more than 30 years of friendship. I'm particularly honored by the presence of President Ma, whom I had the pleasure and honor of hosting to dinner in my home and at a bak kut teh stall in Singapore, which unfortunately closed down at the end of July. And in that bak kut teh stall, are pictures of me with President Ma. And I was very nostalgic, so I took pictures of myself against that picture, knowing that the store will be closed. I'm delighted to be here today, and I want to thank Dr. Kwan, Shisong for arranging this visit for me to Taiwan. I'm so happy to be back. I want to thank the organizations, the university, and other, and the foundations, of course, for sponsoring this organization and making all the fine arrangements. I first came to Taiwan in 1976. I had just graduated in England, gone over to the US to train in the US Army for 3 months as a signals officer. Then I went to Hawaii. I decided I wanted to visit Taiwan. On our passports, we were not allowed to visit Taiwan or Dalu. But the Taiwan consulate in Honolulu made special arrangements to put the visa on a separate piece of paper. So I applied for the visa, and my arrival in Taiwan was a little uncomfortable because the customs were very strict. There was a little box which I used to keep little things. The customs official took it up and said, "This is from China," and threw it away. I was quite stunned. And in fact, in my suitcase, I had the collected works in 4 volumes of Mao Zedong with the covers torn out because I was afraid of Singapore authorities. Then I thought, wow, if the Taiwan customs official had seen the works of Mao Zedong, I would have been, I think, caught up for a friendly conversation. So I was a little rattled my first visit. You see, my mother was from Shantou. She married my father when she was at the age of 19. And she had always told me that Taiwan is a part of China. And the only reason why it was separate was because of the Americans. Now, she was not pro-communist because the family suffered a lot because of the overseas Chinese connection. But she was always loyal to the idea of China till she died. So I came with a certain baggage in my mind. And I had a relative here who invited me to dinner. They were high KMT officials. I don't know who they were. And I didn't quite like the way, when the waitress spilled something on one of them, their reaction. I said, oh, this is a little too strong, I think. I think at that time, Taiwan society was quite repressive. It was the first stage of economic development. And many Westerners considered Lee Kuan Yew also to be quite repressive. And looking back, yes, he was. Because without law and order, you can't create the conditions for development. Then I went back to work in the army. A year later, I came back to Taiwan for training in Hengchun. And it was incredible because Taiwan gave us such incredible facilities. We wore ROC uniform without the ranks, without the badges. The entire camp was vacated for our use. And Sin Kwang Pu Ping trained all over Taiwan, conducting live firing. I learned that Lee Kuan Yew had a very close relationship with Jiang Jingguo. Jiang Jingguo treated him as a younger brother, 13 years older than Lee Kuan Yew. And I think, without saying so, wanted a Chinese majority Singapore to succeed. And to succeed, we had to pick up the gun. To pick up the gun, we had to learn how to use the gun. We needed training areas. And Taiwan, in those critical years when we were most vulnerable, provided us the training areas. Which is why Singapore will never forget Taiwan's contribution to our independence. I remember one year at the Chinese New Year gathering for grassroots leaders in Singapore. There was no media publicity. And Lee Kuan Yew gave a speech. He said, "The mainland considers me an old friend, but Taiwan is an older friend." But in his interaction with Chiang Ching-kuo, he made clear that one day Singapore will recognize Beijing. And when that day happened, the ROC flag, the ROC crest in Singapore would have to come down. So when we established diplomatic relations with China in 1990, there was no issue because there was never any false expectation. Chiang Ching-kuo was getting old, and Lee Kuan Yew was briefing us in cabinet that he was already going to dismantle martial law, Taiwan would enter a new phase of development, and Singapore ministers would have to know new Taiwan leaders. I also remember him saying that regardless whether or not we had diplomatic relations with China, he would have to come to Taiwan for Chiang Ching-kuo's funeral, which he did. I was in the army, then was posted to the Air Force. My first boss in the Air Force was an ROC Air Force pilot, Fu Chun-hsien. I think he was a one-star general in Taiwan, but because in Singapore we all had low ranks, so he became a lieutenant colonel. A wonderful person from Shantung. And I learned so much from him, not only about the Air Force, but also about China and Taiwan society. He was famous because he was the first ROC fighter pilot to shoot down a mainland MiG with a sidewinder. So I think the mainland had his records. So one day he told me, "I'm going to China, to Dalu, to Shantung." Singapore at that time had no diplomatic relations with China, but they had an office in Singapore. So he went to the office in Singapore with his Singapore passport and asked for a permit to enter China, feeling a little anxious. But in fact, the Chinese knew his complete background and said, "Look, is there anything we can do for you when you visit your Lao Jia Xiang?" He said, "Oh, no need, not necessary." And he had a very good visit, and after that he went back repeatedly. And a few years ago he died in Los Angeles. And I sent online my message of condolence to my old boss. Then I became Director of Joint Operations and Planning. And then I came to Taiwan as a senior officer, and I met many Taiwan generals and drank a lot of Gao Liang Jiu. And I learned one thing, that the higher the rank, the better the quality. And the less a hangover. But it was for me a glimpse into an old China, where many of the officers were from Shantung, and very warm people. When I became a minister, Lee Kuan Yew taught me many things. And in many cabinet meetings, he talked about Taiwan. In 1989, the first APEC meeting was held in Canberra. It was at the same time as the Berlin Wall came down. And at that first meeting, we were talking about the three Chinas, meaning the mainland, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and how to bring them in. the following year we had a meeting in Singapore, and we kind of agreed that APEC should be an economic ministers meeting. And when the leaders met, it was not a summit, but a meeting of economic leaders. Then the following year in Seoul, where I met Vice President Vincent Hsu for the first time, an agreement was struck that no flags, no political names at APEC, Taiwan and Hong Kong will be represented by one minister. And then the following year, in 1992, in Bangkok, Taiwan was represented by Vice President Vincent Hsu, China by Li Lanxing, Hong Kong by Brian Chow Tak Hei. And at lunch, we gathered, it was a buffet together to eat. I felt that I was like a relative joining a family lunch. I was so emotional. I can't remember what we discussed, but I remember the significance of that gathering where the discussion was intimate, friendly, casual. A period in history has passed. 1992, 九二共识. 1993, the Wangku talks in Singapore. Now, Singapore was not involved in mediating the two sides. Singapore only provided tables and chairs. But why did they choose Singapore? Because they felt that Singapore was friendly, meant both sides well. And I was involved in preserving Wang Qingyuan, which Sun Zhongshan先生 had stayed in many times, where some of the uprisings against the Qing dynasty was organized. So I said it must become a national monument for us. And Li Kuan Yew opened it as Sun Zhongshan Nangyang Jinieguan. And Feng Chonghan, the director, there was a big boulder cleft in two. On one side, the calligraphy by Gu Zhenfu, the other side, the calligraphy by Wang Taohan, expressing the hope that one day the boulder will come together again. And leaders of both Taiwan and the mainland have been visiting Wang Qingyuan, not only as a Jinieguan, but almost as a shrine to a common origin and the hope for a common future. When I became trade minister in 1999, negotiations were already going on for both the mainland and Taiwan to join the WTO as customs territories. But at the end of 2000, big change in Taiwan because of the elections. I was in Taipei's home, watching the election results. Everybody was somber because the KMT had lost. And I still remember watching live on television very unhappy people around the presidential palace. Li Tenghui Zongtong did not speak. And in the end, it was President Ma who came out to comfort the crowd and to tell them, please go home and take a rest. I was so, President Ma, that night when I watched you, I was so moved. I said, leadership is expressed in such moments, not when times are calm and things are easy. And at that critical moment, which you could not have planned for, you did the right thing and you were able to maintain the peace in Taipei. But in Taiwan, there was a seismic shift, especially among young people, because memories of the old KMT, old bitter feelings have been bottled up. And the process of democratization had still to fully run its course. Taiwan society had changed. And this change, in fact, began during the time of President Lee Teng-hui. I remember in 1994, when Shiba Ryutaro the novelist interviewed Lee Teng-hui, and he talked about taking the Taiwanese people out from Egypt. There was consternation among the KMT old guys. I remember General Hao Bo-chun. He couldn't accept it. Now, he was a wonderful person. I played golf with him. I think it was at Dashi golf course. It was lightning and thunder. I thought he would stop the game. He said, no, this is at wartime. I continued playing. He had short, accurate shots. You know. My golf was much poorer than his. But I was watching him, I said, a veteran of the Civil War, nerves of steel, nothing rattled him. But when President Lee made those remarks, inside, he was angry. But something had already shifted in Taiwan society. When Lee Kuan Yew heard of the interview, he was very troubled. And after that, in his subsequent meetings with President Lee Teng-hui, he was very cautious. I was with him when he met Lee Teng-hui in Dashi, because it was not convenient to go into Taipei City, so we were outside. He was very careful now, being very polite, but trying to understand what was the shift in Taiwan society. In 1999, I called on President Lee. He gave me a copy of his book, Taiwan's Road to Democracy. We were talking about Yasukuni, and I expressed misgivings about Japanese leaders visiting Yasukuni. His response surprised me. He said, what is wrong with that? They are just honoring their war dead. I did not realize at that time that his own brother was being remembered in Yasukuni. But Singapore could not take sides. And our gratitude to Taiwan transcended Taiwan's domestic politics. And today, I speak as an individual, not for the government, because I have my own views, which overlap with the government's, but I do not speak for the government. And I hope you respect this position that I take. Chen Shui-bian had taken over, but I knew Taiwan was going to join the WTO, and Singapore had embarked on FTAs. So in June 2001, after the Hainan spy plane incident, when US-China relations were very tense, the trade ministers met in Shanghai. So I met both Shi Guangsheng, the Chinese commerce minister, and I met Lin Xingyi, Taiwan's trade minister. I told Minister Lin, I said, why don't Singapore and Taiwan, under the WTO rules, have a free trade agreement? So I drafted 3 sentences for him. I said, we launch under the dragon's nose in Shanghai. He thanked me. He said, I got to check back with Taipei. Taipei came back with two pages, all political statements. I said, no, we cannot do this. The following year, I tried again. Again, it could not be done. Then China found out. And one day after a meeting, I was with Shi Guangsheng. He pulled me aside. He said, you cannot launch negotiations with Taiwan. If you do that, we will not launch negotiations with Singapore for a free trade agreement. And a Western reporter heard this. He said, can you give your reply? I have to report that China's minister had threatened the Singapore minister. I said, no, it's a private conversation. I do not comment on private conversation. But Singapore and Taiwan, as customs territories, have a right to have a free trade agreement. But in practice, we stopped, because a free trade agreement with China was much more valuable to Singapore. In any case, Taiwan itself was reluctant to have one which is apolitical. It was many years later when it was China which told Singapore, negotiate a free trade agreement with Taiwan. And that was because it was under President Ma's time. China itself had a free trade agreement with Taiwan, and after that, Singapore had a free trade agreement with Taiwan. So in different ways, Singapore somehow got caught up. When I became foreign minister in 2004, I could no longer come to Taiwan, because that's part of the discipline of our one China policy. But in 2004, when I became foreign minister, we had a big problem with the mainland. Because a month earlier, Deputy Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong had visited Taiwan. The agreement was no publicity. But in Taiwan, all the newspapers and television stations made it headline news. And this went on for 2-3 days. So Dalu was very angry because their position was being undermined by Singapore. And suddenly our relations with Dalu went below 0 degrees. And this was the first issue I had to deal with as foreign minister. It was a very bad time for me because my youngest son had just had a second relapse of his leukemia and needed a bone marrow transplant. And even with a bone marrow transplant, the chance of him surviving would be less than 10%. So among his siblings, there was no match. In Singapore, there was no match. In Hong Kong, there was no match. Finally, through Tzu Chi Foundation in Taiwan, we found a match. And that saved him. They were in Memphis for the bone marrow transplant. I went to give my speech at the UN General Assembly, where I reaffirmed Singapore's one China policy, because I was going to meet Li Zhaoxing, the Chinese foreign minister, in New York. Taiwan diplomats in New York were very unhappy with me. They felt that I should not have said that at the UN General Assembly. And I was severely criticized by Taiwan. My reply was, I'm very sad about this. Our people-to-people relations remain very good. I could not say at the time that it was Taiwan which was helping to save my son, because the bone marrow, which was taken from the donor, had to clear customs without being x-rayed. And Taiwan's foreign ministry facilitated everything. So this time when I came, the first thing we did when we landed was to go to Hualien to call on Zheng Yan Sangren. And she was so happy to see my son Freddie, who is here today, who's now 29 years old and graduated as a doctor. They were so happy to see that the efforts they put in have borne one fruit in our family. And we remain eternally grateful to Tzu Chi. And I always ask myself, why is Tzu Chi a Taiwan phenomenon? We don't find Tzu Chi in other countries. Of course, in Taiwan, there are other Buddhist organizations like Fa Gu, Fo Guan, and Zhong Tai, but my familiarity is with Tzu Chi. And what they do, not just for Taiwanese people, but for the people of the world, is remarkable. It's remarkable. So when I see the division in Taiwan today between blue and green, it is very painful to watch. In both the blue and green, we have unrun. We have people who have helped us, gone out of their way to save us. I cannot believe that Taiwanese are not Chinese. I mean, when I come to Taiwan, it reminds me so much of a China that has attenuated after 49. And therefore, a China that is closer to the China that we know in Singapore, that I saw in my own parents and relatives. This year, on the third day of the third month, I do Tai Chi. My Tai Chi master said, okay, everybody should now buy Xuan Di, the Wutang Tai Chi master who is our patron saint. And I remember one year we went to Yilan, we went to Sanqing Miao to practice Tai Chi. And that's the mother temple of all the Taoist temples in Taiwan. And at the level of ordinary people, whether it is Chinese New Year, the 7th month, Zhongqiu, the same celebrations. The division is at a political level, not at the cultural or at the civilizational level. Yesterday, I had a meeting with young employees of MaiCoin, and one of them said, I'm Taiwanese. I don't feel I'm Chinese. I can understand why he said that, because he was expressing a political feeling. To be Chinese is not to be a citizen of the PRC. But when they say they cannot accept being called a Chinese because they see in it a political danger that may be absorbed into the mainland, that I can understand. And if I were a young Taiwanese, I may feel the same way. Lee Kuan Yew once said, between China and Taiwan, we say千里. It's like a long journey. The Americans do not want the two to ever come together, to continue on parallel paths forever. That would be the American preferred position, because then Taiwan will never be an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the mainland. Then Taiwan is an additional piece they can use in a great game. That is the American position. Then for the mainland, Lee Kuan Yew said, of course they want the two paths to come together, today if possible. Then they said, for Singapore, we hope they will come together, but not too soon. But not too soon, because both are unrun to Singapore. So it's not bad if we continue to nourish old friendships, old relationships. The status quo, which everyone likes to say is the preferred position, is not a permanent solution. It is only a temporary solution, because the question of Taiwan is ultimately a question of US-China relations. The US accepted that Taiwan is part of China. This was in the Cairo Declaration. This was affirmed in the Potsdam Proclamation. This was the position the US took during the Civil War. So the US helped the Taiwanese Navy occupy islands in the South China Sea. And it's not a surprise that Taiwan's position on Diaoyu, on the South China Sea islands, are the same as the mainland. And I remember having conversations with President Ma about the Diaoyu Island, for whom this is an issue of principle. And when I called on President Ma before he stepped down, it was in 2016, April, I think, you had just gone to Taiping Town. And you told me about how the island produced 20 tons of fresh water a day. And you brought back drums of fresh water from Taiping Tao, as if they are holy water from a Catholic shrine. And I told Singapore friends that if I asked a bottle from you, you would have given it to me at that time. And this was the American position. But when the mainland became a problem, a challenge to America, the Korean War, the Seventh Fleet came in. It was in American interest to keep the two apart. Kissinger, when he negotiated normalization of relations with China, in his meetings with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, said, again and again, the conversation came back to Taiwan. That on this issue, the Chinese showed no flexibility. It's bedrock. It is not a card which America can play against China because it would lead to a rupture and maybe even to war. And in recent years, relations have become quite bad. Both sides think of war scenarios. What happens if there is war? What will each side do? If China were to forcibly take over Taiwan, what would the US do? These are scenarios which the Indo-Pacific Command, as a matter of professionalism, have to think through and exercise. RAND has also done such exercises. I think the US have come to the conclusion that if it's a conventional war, there is no certainty of winning. In fact, there's a good chance that they may lose. Because China now has hypersonic missiles. We can travel maybe 2,000–3,000 kilometers to hit US aircraft carriers, which means that aircraft carriers have to stay away and cannot intervene in Taiwan. So for the Americans, if they want to deter China, they must be able to threaten China with nuclear weapons, tactical, and maybe up the scale if necessary. And you can be sure that on both sides, in dark rooms, there are strategic thinkers who work through the scenarios. China knows that the US wants to deny it a counter-strike capability. They put their missiles now on high-speed train. It's about the same length. And China has lots of tunnels, so they can hide the missiles in the tunnels. But today with satellites, you can monitor every railroad, every fast train, the entrance and the exit to every tunnel. So China is not sure that its land-based ICBMs can hit back. So they know they need submarines. And the only sea which is deep enough is the South China Sea. And in ASEAN, we don't want to get involved in this. We have our claims, we have our economic interests, but we are not involved in nuclear warfare. And the reason for AUKUS is to add maybe another 8 Australian attack submarines so that every strategic submarine in the PLA Navy can be tracked and hunted down. Now this is, to me, madness, you know. They are thinking of the possibility of a nuclear exchange. But when I was in the military, this is my job. I got to think through all this. So China knows that it must have an assured counter-strike capability because the US wants to deny China a counter-strike capability. So from a few hundred warheads, it's going to increase it to maybe 1,000–2,000, I don't know. And we read that in Xinjiang, they're building many silos. So maybe for every ICBM, they may have 2 empty silos, like an MX game, you know, so that it's hard for the Americans to destroy everything in the first try. Now, if I were Taiwanese, think about this. In 10 years' time, China will have almost a certain counter-strike capability against the US. So at a conventional level, they may not prevail. At the nuclear level, the risks are too high. At that point, the pressure on Taiwan, political, military, economic pressure, is bound to grow. So therefore, the status quo is a ticking bomb. To say, keep the status quo, is to say, let it tick. It will not tick forever. In 10 years' time, you'll be ticking much faster. Lee Kuan Yew had always taken the position that it is better for Taiwan to negotiate with the mainland earlier rather than later. Because the longer you wait, the weaker your relative negotiating position. But of course, there are Taiwanese who believe that maybe if you wait long enough, something will happen to the mainland. Some big struggle in the Communist Party, a new civil war, and then a path for Taiwan to escape and become independent. Li Teng-hui said, take Taiwan out from Egypt. Well, maybe one day the Red Sea will open. But you cannot base policy on such a possibility. It's too dangerous. It may happen, but it's not a high chance. And policy cannot be based on that. So, from me watching this, with some emotion, but not with the emotion of a Taiwanese, I say, no, better to negotiate now, which is why we had the 九二共识, which was why we had the free trade agreement under President Ma. And there's this view that President Xi Jinping can't wait to invade Taiwan for his legacy. This, to me, is not consistent with what he did in 2015. When in Singapore, President Xi met President Ma over dinner at the Shangri-La. At that time, I was with the Kwok group. So I asked one of the Kwoks, I said, who paid for the bill? She told me 50-50, down to the last cent. I remember President Ma brought Jingmen Gaoliang, and President Xi, of course, brought Guizhou Mao Tai. No? I think both are equally good, equally strong. And the words spoken that evening was so moving. I mean, I'm not from Taiwan, not from mainland, but I'm ethnic Chinese. And I was really moved by those words. And I remember talking to Robert Kwok about it. He too was moved by those words, and moved by the symbolism of that meeting, where both sides transcended politics. They addressed each other as Seng Sheng. Not Mr. Mr. is the low-level way of addressing. Seng Sheng is the highest level of addressing each other. In other words, the key is to go up, not to go down. But at that time, President Mao was already stepping down. And everyone knew that it was likely that Tsai Ing-wen would become president. With Vice President Vincent Hsu's help, I called on Tsai Ing-wen after she was elected, before she was sworn in. She said that China did not have a positive attitude. I told her, I said, in Singapore, Xi Jinping had opened the road for you. She did not respond to me, but she knew what I meant. But I knew that she could not take that road, because that road requires her to accept a one China consensus. And she could not take it. In the DPP constitution, it says our goal is an independent republic of Taiwan, even though both Chen Shui-bian and Tsai Ing-wen swore on the 民国宪法 of one China. So this is something which is very wrenching for green Taiwanese. They know that there is a road, but that road means that there could be a trap, because one China may mean one PRC, equal 两制. So they say no. The alternative is a dead end and tragedy, not just for Taiwan and the mainland, but I think for Singapore and for the entire region, for the world, if there's war between China and the US. This road is not a superhighway, but it's not a bad road. And one China, the PRC did not say one PRC policy. It says one China. It did not say when. It says 什么都可以谈. You can discuss everything. So when Zhu Lilun, whom I had dinner with last night, he was in America. He said there is no consensus on the one China consensus, on the 九二共识. He said, I was just using the words of Hu Zhenfu. Ambiguity is the key to the future. I mean, in Tai Chi, I do Tai Chi for 15 years. In Tao Te Ching, the second line, 名可名,非常名. If you define it too much, it disappears. So ambiguity is necessary. The mainland will accept some ambiguity. Taiwan should accept some ambiguity. The problem is the DPP constitution. Please excuse me if I speak out of turn, but this is my musing, my fantasizing. Maybe it is possible for the two sides to agree to some kind of a Chinese Commonwealth. Li Xiulian talked about it, Vice President Li Xiulian talked about it. I wrote it in English, so I was told in Taiwan, translated as Bang Lian, not Lian Ban. Because Lian Ban has got other connotations, there are too many other references. There are precedents. In Iceland, the Icelandic people met every year in the Rift Valley. They make laws. They talk about trade disputes. They pass judgments. They punish. Then they went back to their separate valleys. There was no executive, no common executive. It was called the Eltingi. It was Europe's earliest modern democracy. Then if you study Switzerland, the cantons came together to form the Helvetian Confederation. Again, they had no executive, but they met to discuss common problems. So when we talk about one China, maybe we can talk about the one China Commonwealth, where the two sides talk about trade, cooperation, problems, agree on certain principles, without the need for a common executive. Can the mainland accept that? I think they can. Why do I say that? If you look at Macau, Macau in the 16th century was given to the Portuguese. It was not taken from the Ming dynasty, because China wanted the Portuguese to have their own area and don't trouble me. And the Portuguese understood that. Never be a problem to China. The Qing dynasty renewed it. But in the 19th century, when China was being ravaged by the imperial powers, Portugal decided to take Macau. But they had a revolution in 1973. And they said, we want to return Macau immediately to China. What did China say? China said, no. We have to settle Hong Kong first. Please stay. So it was only in 1999 that Macau returned to the mainland. And even to today, there is no practical change in how Macau is run or the Macanese way of life. We do not know what China will be in 20 years' time. China today is very different from China 20 years ago, unrecognizable of what China was 40 years ago. So 20 years from now, 40 years from now, what will China be? What will Taiwan be? So in my free moments, it's something I play in my mind, the possibility of a Chinese Commonwealth where they come together, where you maintain your links with America, but not to an extent which threatens China, where you maintain your links to Singapore and other countries, where Sin Guang Pu Ping can still be in Taiwan with no problem. But as I said, the problem is the party constitution of the DPP. Maybe it's possible. You can't change the constitution. It's too difficult. But maybe it is possible for the various political parties in Taiwan to add a preamble of what one China means to Taiwan. What does it mean to Taiwan? So you make your position clearer, and leave the mainland to do what it wants. But you make your position clearer. And this is to the advantage of Taiwanese people. Because if you are divided in Taiwan, your position is weakened. But if among the political parties there is broad consensus about the 九二共识, that it means for a prolonged period a Commonwealth, not a PRC, not an ROC, maybe by that time it's just called China, and you can apply this in Olympic Games and other international organizations, that there is a way forward. And I believe a little clarification on the Taiwan side will enable Taiwan to go back on the road, which was opened by Xi Jinping and Ma Ying-jeou in Singapore in 2015. It will only work if Taiwan is valuable to the mainland. What makes Taiwan valuable to the mainland? Why do Singaporeans and Hong Kongers and others like to visit Taiwan? It's a great physical beauty. The people are very cultured. The food is excellent. There is a common courtesy among young and old, even to foreigners. And there is a cosmopolitan feel to it. You're an American, a Japanese, you come to Taiwan, you feel, yes, you're comfortable. You may have some difficulty here and there, but basically it's an international society. You know, because Taiwan politically is in a very constrained position and getting more and more constricted, there is almost a psychological sublimation of Taiwan, which has enabled it to excel in other areas. I talk about Tzu Chi. I think Tzu Chi and the other Buddhist organizations are Taiwan's response to what it could not express at a political level. And so it finds expression at a higher spiritual level by helping the world. And we ourselves are beneficiaries of this. China has not got a Tzu Chi. Singapore has not got a Tzu Chi. No other country has a Tzu Chi. Why? Is it in Chinese history? Not really. It's in Taiwan's history because of your political position. The other area where you have excelled is in semiconductors. You know, Vivek Ramaswamy, the Republican candidate, very clever, very eloquent. He said, no, we must get TSMC to go to the US. Then in 10 years, we don't need Taiwan anymore. We can give it to China. He doesn't understand that TSMC is not just factories and individuals. TSMC grew up in an ecosystem, in a Taiwanese ecosystem. It cannot be replicated in America. It cannot be fully replicated in China. It cannot be replicated in Singapore. Why is that? To begin with, you are a very educated population, smart people. I'm so honored that the K.T. Lee Foundation, K.T. Lee was the father of all this, laid the foundation. You couldn't have done it without your mainland connection. You couldn't have done it without the American connection, without the Japanese connection. All these are layers in Taiwan society, which makes you unique, special, and valuable to the mainland. Convergence as equals will only work if Taiwan continues to be of value to the mainland. This is how Singapore conducts relations with China. There was a period when China needed Singapore for many things. But we know that for those things, China no longer needs Singapore. So we must continue to have things which China wants, which it cannot develop for itself in Singapore, for us to be of continuing interest to China. And indeed, we do this for the entire world, that we only prosper by being of value, by contributing to the well-being of others. And this Taiwan must continue to do, and can continue to do, provided your young people, your smart people, remain in Taiwan, that even when they walk overseas, in their hearts, they are still Taiwanese. That is the key. My son was saved in St. Jude Hospital by a doctor, Pei Zhengkang, Pei, famous family during Tang Dynasty, 上面妃字，下面一字，衣服的衣。He's 雍正的正，康熙的康，所以这是 very weighty name. 江苏人 ，born, grew up in Hong Kong, 台大毕业生 and he told me he's always grateful to 台大 and to Taiwan for educating him. Then he went to America and became the #1 doctor in the world for the treatment of childhood leukemia, bringing the cure rate from 40% to 94% with minimal morbidity. And when my family was in Taiwan, I was in Memphis, he got the Christian Taiwanese community in Memphis to help look after my family. So there's something special about Taiwan. But the key is, in Taiwan, there must be hope for the future. I asked the young people I met yesterday, in 20 years' time, when you are married with children, where do you want your children to be? What passports do you want them to hold? If all we can tell them is the status quo, they will leave. But if we can give them hope for the future, not only will Taiwanese stay in Taiwan and remain Taiwanese, others will want to live here. Thank you.
The first one is from Louis. Do you think that while the 1992 consensus may promote cross-strait communications, it will seriously undermine ROC's sovereignty?
This is the tail end of a long civil war. Yesterday, I was at the Grand Hotel.徐宗懋brought us there to see the old photographs. This was an epic drama, the fight between Mao Zedong and Jiang Jieshi. They fought and met everywhere in China. And we have reached the end of the Civil War. It's peaceful. And we hope that that final chapter can be written peacefully. The key is US-China relations. Taiwan is only separate because of America. And for America, Taiwan is just a piece on the chessboard. We ask ourselves, the relative power of China and the US 10 years ago, of China and the US today, of China and the US 10 years from now, 20 years from now. There was a time when US GIs were in the streets of Taipei, not that long ago. the US will not be able to maintain the same relative position. And as China goes stronger, that final chapter will have to close.
And we have second question from Thomas Hu. How should we promote the idea that PRC can be a loyal opposition in the US-led world order and Taiwan a loyal opposition in the Chinese-speaking world?
I find it a bit difficult to fit my thinking into those categories in the question. I don't think it's a good idea to talk about opposition. US-China relations are very important for the entire world. If there is a conflict between them, it will destroy the world. So all of us should be working towards harmony. And between the mainland and Taiwan, we should work towards harmony. Because without harmony, there's no hope for the future.
And next, we have a question from Edward Xiao. And sorry, Edward, I translated your question for you. At a time when the world is following the footsteps of the United States and hyping up China's invasion of Taiwan, do you think China would rather adopt peaceful reunification in the future than use force to resolve the conflict?
No, China, of course, wants peaceful reunification. It wants Taiwan as an asset, as a precious heirloom with wonderful properties, wonderful value. That's what China would want. I was watching Da Qing Fu, the 72-part series about the Qing dynasty and unification of China, and how Qin Shi Huang wanted the Jiu Ding, but it disappeared. He wanted to take it by force, so it disappeared. Taiwan, to me, is a precious thing. And it should take its rightful place. It should not disappear. It should not be damaged.
And next question is from Lawrence Chong. Do you think the one country, two systems formula is good for Taiwan? If so, do you think Taiwan will end up like Hong Kong by accepting this arrangement?
Oh, no. I mean, for Hong Kong, it is a return to the PRC, which is why in Taiwan, one country, two systems cannot be accepted, because underlying it is a presumption that it is one PRC, two systems. So this cannot be acceptable to the ROC. As I said, this is still part of the Civil War. So the ROC has its own history, its own beliefs, its own philosophy, its own claims. And in the end, you either have a hostile acquisition, which would be a disaster for everybody, or you have a peaceful merger of equals. And that, to me, is achievable, because both sides will benefit from it. And not just for Taiwanese, I think it's of great value to the mainland. I mean, you can't say it, but there's a lot that the mainland can learn from Taiwan. I mean, someone spoke about the healthcare system in Taiwan, about how people treat one another, about the respect for the environment. No, the hills here are so wonderfully cladded. In agriculture, Taiwan has done so much. No, the mainland has since caught up. But you've maintained an organic way of life, which if you can replicate, let us say, 70 times on the mainland, can you imagine what a remarkable place the mainland will be if, to varying degrees, they're all a little like Taiwan on the mainland. And I believe the mainlanders who come to Taiwan, they know this. There are political problems with Japan. Part of it is because of the period of Japanese rule. I mean, I see it when I come here. I mean, I have no sympathies for what the Japanese did, you know, but regardless, as the British left things behind in Singapore, Japan has left things behind here, which has added to you. And the American influence in Taiwan is everywhere. You may not even be conscious, but it's added to you. But have you become non-Chinese? Of course not, because Chinese programming is profound, it's very deep. So you have become a hybrid, which is, in the Chinese garden, a very wonderful plant in that garden, and which I believe everyone in the garden would want to maintain and see thriving forever.
And next question is from Sam Hong. What is the nature of conflict between mainland China and Taiwan when Taiwan poses no threat to China at all?
No, China's hope, China's deep emotion is for reunification. And this is not just mainland Chinese. I would say that for my mother, I would say for me emotionally, it's important to see eventual reunification. Why? Because of the circumstances which separated Taiwan from the mainland. 甲午战争, the ravaging of the Chinese mainland, the humiliation of Chinese all over the world, not just on the mainland in Taiwan, but because they spat on China, they had no regard for it. 五四运动, when despite being part of victorious powers, it had no claim to Shantung, to German possessions in Shantung. That created a political awakening throughout the Nanyang. And many events in the Nanyang could be traced back to 五四, to the 新文化运动. So we are part of one larger civilization. So the idea of a Taiwan which is separate from mainland suggests that a historical problem has still not been resolved. But how it should be resolved is for creative minds on both sides to think through, respecting each other, respecting the history, seeing the common origins, and finding ways towards a common prosperous future. And I was quite, I think 1996, I accompanied Lee Kuan Yew to Ningpo, and they brought us to Fenghua to see Chiang Kai-shek's old hometown. And he reminded me of his residence here. There's a certain respect for Chiang Kai-shek as protagonist in a civil war. And in Chinese history, when they talk about previous dynasties, yeah, they're protagonists, but they're all treated with respect. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. A certain judgment is formed, and it enters the popular folklore. And one day, Taiwanese heroes, KMT heroes, will be part of the romances in China's history. That's why when President Ma Ying-jeou made his visit to Nanjing, Changsha, Wuhan recently, I must say, I was very moved. You know, I've been to all those places, visited the same shrines, the same tombs, and so on, the same museums. I said, yes, it is a common history, and how can there not be a common future? There will only be a separate future if America makes it a separate future, and I think America will find it increasingly difficult to keep Taiwan separate from China, and therefore, the best outcome is convergence and peaceful reunification, not on the basis of the PRC and ROC, but on some future entity which we can call China, simply.
As we're running out of time, we will take one last question from our audience. This is from Sunny H. How can a Chinese Commonwealth be developed when there are two different ideologies, communism and democracy, on opposite sides?
The way is to transcend the politics. So when we talk about 慈济, we don't talk about politics. When we talk about semiconductors, we don't talk about politics. I mean, it can be politicized, but we are talking about the level of science, of physics, of process engineering, of lithography, of quantum mechanics. In these areas, scientists on both sides will learn from each other and enjoy each other's company and friendship. So transcend it. So I'm proposing, there must be better ways. These are just my random thoughts. There must be ways to transcend the politics to achieve a higher unity, not by fighting to keep every last embassy or saying that, oh, I must be a member here or a member there. No, transcend it. And in transcending it, assert a moral quality which even the mainland will have to accept. But if it's just at the level of politics, Taiwan will be in a very weak position and will be in a weakening position.
All right, thank you, Mr. Yo. And that concludes the first half of the forum. We will be taking a 20-minute tea break, and please reconvene into this room for our panel discussion at 10:40. Before we proceed with today's panel, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Professor Zhongmin Guan, who is also the organizer of this forum. Please welcome Professor Guan to the stage. And on this panel, we are honored to have Mr. George Yo. Mr. George Yo, please welcome to the stage. Mr. Yo is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore, and he is now a visiting scholar at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. And next, we welcome our panelist, Mr. David Lin, to the stage. Mr. David Lin, Lin永乐部长, is our former Minister of Foreign Affairs, who now serves as chairman of the Association of Foreign Relations. And finally, let's welcome Professor Philip Xu. Professor Xu teaches political science and serves as the director of the Center for China Studies at National Taiwan University. Please be seated, and now the floor is yours, Professor Guan.
In the beginning of this session, first, of course, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Mr. George Yo, our cousin from over the sea. And thank George for sharing his experience and the connections with Taiwan, and also his insights on the complex cross-strait relations with us and between us and mainland China. George talked about different things, but I think there's one thing important that the message that George wanted to convey in his speech is that he encouraged Taiwan to plan our future realistically, instead of relying on some utterly simplified beliefs. And I don't know, our audience may or may not agree George's points completely. But I think none of us can deny George speaks in a very different way. He did not speak as a cold third party. He actually speaks from his bottom of his heart, as far as I can tell. And his speech filled with warmth, affection for Taiwan. this is something different from lots of different speech that I heard in the past years. So I must thank Georgia again for this wonderful and inspiring speech. And now I think we can start our discussion. Currently, numerous studies and poll data show that most Taiwanese support the status quo. And of course, George, in his speech, explained how difficult how the status quo can be interpreted and how the status quo could be maintained or not. But George seems to suggest that the current situation, the status quo, is unstable and transient. We all know that after the nationalist government moved to Taiwan in 1949, and there are already lots of military conflicts between us and the mainland China in the beginning years. And during that time, I believe lots of people, including foreign observers, they will believe that that period of time is transient and unstable. But it has been almost 65 years since the second Taiwan Strait crisis in 1958. And also, it has been almost 45 years since the PRC stopped regularly artillery gunfighting, shooting those artillery rounds onto Kinmen in 1979. So after long periods of time, without any further provocation, why can we think about such a long period of time? It's kind of already stable to some sense. Do we still consider these long periods of time transient and unstable? George?
The period of peace bought Taiwan time to reform its own society, to educate its population, and to grow, and to become a global player. So you need peace to do all that. The status quo is not a time to relax and do nothing, because the clock is ticking. The status quo buys time to do things that need to be done in order to create hope for the future. If this time is wasted, it can lead to tragedy. So I'm always concerned when politicians talk about the status quo as if the status quo is a stable state. It is not a stable state. It is a transient, but it's a valuable transient to do things.
Suppose there's no foreign intervention. For example, we all know the cross-strait relation become worse, especially in the last few years, partly because of the US and the mainland China contest. Without such confrontation, would this past of 5 or 6 decades be considered is already a state that is gradually converging to a steady state?
The US is increasingly threatened by a rising China. China does not threaten the US militarily, but China threatens US dominance in the world. And because of this, US strategic preoccupation now is with trying to slow China down, contain China, pull down China if possible. So all of us are familiar with the chip war which is going on, and the systematic effort done by whole departments in Washington to find ways to slow down China, to degrade China if possible. Of course, whether they succeed or not depends on how China responds. So Taiwan is caught in this larger struggle. So the question for Taiwan is this: you cannot affect US-China relations, but you can decide how much you want to be used by America against China. If you decide that you want to be used by America against China in the hope that one day there is a chance the door opens and I rush out and become independent, then understand that there is a big risk involved. But I think it is better for ordinary people who only want peaceful lives for themselves and their children to say, look, don't drag me in. This is your fight. This is your fight. So you notice that how much Taiwan green leaders may want to push. They are limited by what the US allows them to do. So the US will not allow Taiwan to affect their game. But if you allow yourself to be used by the US, you will be used by the US when it's convenient for the US. And if it's no longer convenient for the US, Taiwan will be sacrificed, which was what happened in '72. So I think if I were Taiwanese, I say, no. I need the US because it improves my relationship, my negotiating position with China, but do not become a plaything of the US. Then all of us, our lives are at risk. Yeah.
May I add a point? So George, I agree with you that the status quo may not be permanent, may not be forever, but at the same time, we have to define so what the status quo means for Taiwan. Actually, to me, the status quo means peace and stability, and also cooperation and development. Because over the past 74 years, since 1949, we have tried everything to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. In fact, because of we maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and also in the region, so all countries, including mainland China, including ASEAN countries, including Japan and South Korea, can enjoy such sustainable growth and economic development. So this is really unprecedented and sustainable. So we want to make sure that peace and stability can continue. At the same time, I also agree with you that the United States actually doesn't want to see Taiwan's unification with China. At the same time, China doesn't want to see Taiwan's independence. So there's a dilemma we have to face. At the same time, we have to take into account how we can maintain peace and stability. So for the moment, it seems to me that we have only one option. The option is peace. The option is also how to maintain the status quo. And maintaining the status quo for as long as possible is also in the best interest of all parties concerned. It's also consistent with US interest for the region. And also given the context of US-China strategic competition or great power competition in the region, so Taiwan certainly can take that into account and see how we can cope with the situation, and we can try to maintain peace and stability while in cooperation, in partnership with the United States, with Japan and other like-minded countries. So I think this is still the top priority for Taiwan for the moment.
Okay, thank you. Philip, can you also say something about this, especially about the period of time? If this is just considered transient, and what can we really do during this time period? George just mentioned that at such a time the opportunity is precious. So how can we utilize this period of time to do something to move forward?
Let me respond to Professor Guan's first questions together with Mr. You's responses to that. I agree that the US-China hegemonic competition is one of the most important factors leading to cross-strait instability as well as the fluctuations in the trilateral relations between the US, Taiwan, and China. So in that sense, the current sort of situation or peace is probably to some extent fragile and transient a little bit, right? On the other hand, I guess we have to pay attention to the fact that it is also related, closely related, to Beijing's anxiety about Taiwan public opinion's increasing drifting away from the prospect of unification. For example, there has been a long-standing public opinion survey in Taiwan examining Taiwan people's national identity pattern. In that questions, over the past 2 decades or so, there's only one question and 3 options provided in the questions. The first is whether you identify yourself as a Taiwanese only. The second is that whether you identify yourself as a Chinese only. And the third one is whether you identify yourself both as a Taiwanese and a Chinese. Well, when this public opinion survey began about 3 decades ago, the relative majority, not absolute, but the relative majority was the dual identity, the third option, okay? Which I guess consisted with the mainstream public opinion in Taiwan preferring the maintenance of status quo. However, about 15 years ago, this began to change. The preference for exclusive Taiwanese identity, which is the first option I just mentioned, began to override the respondents favoring the third option. And this sort of changing reality, I guess, is transparent. It's a transparent information for Beijing. And I guess that adds tremendously to Beijing's anxiety that Taiwan seems to be drifting increasingly away from the prospect of unification or the formula of unification set by Beijing. So I think that was a very important factor. And that began to emerge long before the hegemonic competition between the US and China that began roughly around the year 2017. So that's something I want to add. Thank you.
It seems that given such information, does it give mainland China some urgent feeling that they need to do something in a short-term course?
Well, I agree with Minister You's comment when he was made the keynote speech that probably the first priority for Beijing would still be to solve cross-strait disputes or to unify Taiwan through peaceful rather than military means. However, as we know that the predominant view or predominant preference of mainstream public opinion in Taiwan has been favoring the maintenance of status quo compared to the other 2 options, independence or unification. So I think that's also something that has put important constraint on any ruler or political party in Taiwan. And I think that's also a transparent information for Beijing as well. So in that sense, I think Beijing has also not given up the possible sort of second priority option by unify Taiwan through military means. So that's why we've seen the mounting coercive pressures from Beijing, especially in the realm of military security upon Taiwan. So I guess that Beijing has a sort of a sense of chronic crisis or urgency, for it to launch such pressures on Taiwan.
We just mentioned that most Taiwanese do support the status quo and do not want to see the current situation be changed. And it strikes me that any move that breaks the status quo would create more instability and unpredictability of the future. So given the current Taiwanese mentality and this unpredictability, so why should Taiwan initiate a move toward a merger, as you suggested, George?
I always remember what Lee Kuan Yew told us when I was in this cabinet. He said, never govern by polling. Never govern by polling. Because if you are governing by polling, you are not leading. You are being led. And if a society is being led by polls, you will lead to tragedy. And very often, when you are striking new directions, the leader is in the minority. So I'm familiar with all these polls, and I'm sure the mainland is concerned, but the key is leadership, not polls. And leadership must see further than the people being polled. That's why you're a leader. You must look ahead, see the trends, where the dangers are, and say, no, we cannot go that way. You may always think that that way is easier, but you will lead to disaster. No, we take the difficult route, because after that, it'll be a bright future. So this is my response to the idea of polling. the time that we have during the status quo must be time that we use to build trust. Find common areas. If I do not want to be your friend, I will find reasons why we should not meet, why we should be angry with each other. And every little fault is magnified. But if I want to be your friend, and you want to be my friend, we will find common areas and concentrate on common areas and say the difficult things, let's put aside. Find common areas. And after a while, trust grows. And as the circle of trust grows, the overlap increases and all kinds of possibilities, not possible in the past, will emerge. And it is a bit troubling the way education is being pursued, because education influences young minds. I watched in Hong Kong what happened. I'm not saying that the situation is the same here. I was told by a young student who sought me out as a mentor when I was working there. He was only 16 years old. He said, 80% of my teachers are anti-China. And so they became anti-China. And to be a student leader, you had to be anti-China. And it led to a mass illusion that they can be independent. And when you build your hopes on an illusion, it leads to tragedy. So leaders have to say, no, this will lead to tragedy. Look ahead. So trust is important, and it's important not to, in the younger generation, create more distrust. Because if there's more distrust, then the area of overlap reduces, and an unhappy outcome in the future is more likely. So the status quo is not a time to do nothing, it's a time to do a lot of things. And there's a certain, in my view, urgency to it.
Of course, given the current Taiwan situation, I'm not very sure that any leader can choose to ignore the poll or those surveys. And I think there's one thing different between Taiwan and Singapore, that because I agree with you that the reason why we need a leader, because we need the leader's vision and also his courage to take sometimes bold action and to do something. But given the Taiwan situation, we don't just have one leader, not like in Singapore. You have Lee Kuan-yew. But in Taiwan, in early time, President Lee Teng-hui has his views on Taiwan's future. That's what he chose, something that he did. And later on, President Ma Ying-jeou has his view, and he was brave enough to push lots of things. And the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, she also has her own views. So how can we say one leader's view is better, will lead Taiwan to a better future rather than another one's view? So we don't just have a single view on this.
So George, I agree with you that both leadership and understanding polls are important. And leadership may be more important. But in Taiwan's case, of course, we have regular elections, presidential elections, parliamentary elections. So for all leaders, they have to consider the support approval rating from the general public. So when the majority of our people in Taiwan support the status quo, then of course that is one element we have to take into account. On the other hand, I also like to point out that maintaining status quo is not only a strategy, actually that's the direction for the future. At the same time, of course, we need to strengthen our values. You mentioned earlier that Taiwan is a valuable asset, not only for ourselves, but also for the United States, for mainland China, for the entire world. So Taiwan needs to further develop and strengthen Taiwan's values, Taiwan's strength, economically and strategically, including TSMC. I mentioned this the other day. Taiwan already has the largest semiconductor industry in the world. that is also a strength for Taiwan's values. And then Taiwan, of course, is very strategically located. We are in the center of the first island chain. So we can really provide all the opportunities to facilitate trade, sea transportation, air transportation for the region. Taiwan is an important linkage between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. So we need to expand all these activities. We need to make other countries understand Taiwan's values, Taiwan's strength. That is also the guarantee for Taiwan to maintain the path of peace and stability, and also in our way to cope with mainland China.
President Ma's question is beyond our imaginations.
My question is directed to Minister Yu. You mentioned the idea of Chinese representation. Is that? Commonwealth, Chinese Commonwealth. Yeah, this is a fascinating idea. When I met with Xi Jinping 8 years ago in Singapore, I didn't mention that. Have you ever mentioned anything like this to any official from the PRC? Have you ever?
I've mentioned it, I've touched on it. And someone asked me, because I have a prepared script for my speech today, someone asked me if I had shown it to the PRC ambassador. I said, how can I do that?
Is that their only reaction?
My own guess is, no, there's been no reaction. There's been no reaction. My own guess is they will pause and think about it. But I remember in the 90s, I read an article by a senior PRA officer who talked about the possibility of the PRC changing its name if there is a merger with Taiwan, that it has to be a transcending of both entities. So I believe that in their internal thinking, these possibilities are something they would consider. And if Taiwan were to raise it with them, I think you can have a conversation.
Do you have a chance to explain to them what Chinese Commonwealth is?
Sorry, I have to interrupt. We will come back to this issue. Otherwise, I have to ask you to become the moderator now.
Doesn't matter.
We will come back to this question too. Yeah.
No, I'm just very curious. I think that's an interesting idea.
President Ma, what I say today, I'm prepared to say on the mainland.
Yes, we will talk about this.
Yes, I will.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, since President Ma already raised this question, actually that was a question I was about to ask. In George's speech, he did mention that a Chinese Commonwealth may be a potential resolution. Of course, he didn't say that's the resolution. So first, I would like to ask George to say a little bit more on this Chinese Commonwealth, to be more specific, because you did give some example, like based on Iceland, primitive example. And can you say, probably you already have some idea about what the Chinese Commonwealth might be, what kind of mechanism, whatever we call this, 邦联或国协. So, George, would you please say a little bit more on this?
The idea is, do we see a common future? If we see a common future, then we'll find a way, step by step, even though there may have to be detours to get there. Then however close we are, in the end our paths will diverge. And when people talk, and they're very bright people on both sides of the strait, when they start thinking, when they look back at history, when they have the inspiration from other countries and from other civilizations, they'll say, no, we can do this first, we can do that first. You compare mainland Taiwan relations today with what it was in 1980, 1990, 2000. You're already much closer than before. what you now have would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. So 20 years from now, make it closer still. Don't move back, move forward. And I'm sure that when people sit down to talk, many ideas will come up, some will be discarded, others will be considered, some will be practical. And the important thing is benefit people, fishermen, farmers, small businessmen, industrialists, tourists, students, scientists, researchers. If there's benefit, then people will get together, people will learn more, find out more. So for myself, my father was born in Singapore, his father was from China, my mother's from China. I tell my friends, learn more about China because it's going to become very big. If China's per capita GDP reaches half that of the US, it's a quarter now, then China's GDP will be equal to that of the US and EU combined. US and EU combined. Their domestic market is already as significant as the US. So whatever you do, whether as a scientist or as an employee or as a businessman, you cannot ignore China. And the more you study China, the more you say, yeah, I'm part of it. To some extent, even as a Singaporean, I feel I'm a part of it. Because that's my ancestry. And you will feel a part of it. But if you say, no, I don't want to know China, you demonize China, and you put that into young people's minds, eventually they will find out. But only after painful lessons. So Lee Kuan Yew was once asked, what if despite everything the Taiwanese insist on going this way? His reply was, well, it's a question of the price they have to pay before they learn the lesson. So the reason why we have this conversation is to reduce the price the ordinary Taiwanese will have to pay. You look at Ukraine. It is an unbelievable tragedy. To go back to where they were in February 23rd, last year, would have been, is the maximum position they can achieve now, after having lost hundreds of thousands of lives. For what? What have they gained? They could have avoided this position. The Ukraine ambassador in Singapore, a dear friend, Pavlo Soltansky, when the invasion happened, he wrote me an email how he avoided machine gun fire and tanks to make his way to Poland, where he had a son or a daughter working, and became the representative of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry in Ukraine. When he was in Singapore, we had long conversations. He said, no, Russia will implode. Putin cannot remain. I said, but what if he does? So if you build all your hopes on the possibility that the other side will collapse, you will cut options off. And then in the end, you're trapped in a position which is very disadvantageous. So Taiwan now should open the possibilities for the future, not constrict it. And it's important that in the education of the young, your media, everyone has responsibility. But if in the end, people refuse, then we go back to what Lee Kuan Yew said. Then it's a matter of the price you have to pay before you turn back.
Of course, I know in current Taiwan that lots of people think in a different way. And so that's a reason why we want to bring in different opinions. I have to say now, fewer and fewer people are willing to say what you just said. And so we are happy that we have this opportunity to bring your opinion to our general public. And I hope this idea can be spread. Yeah,
thank you. Yeah, thank you, George. I agree with you that demonizing China is not a good idea. We have to cope with China as it rises as a superpower in the world. But actually, as you know, China has been Taiwan's the largest trading partner already for quite some time. So we have maintained close economic cooperation and interaction. That is a fact. So at the same time, of course, we need to strengthen our dialogue and communication with the PRC for the future. I think that is the priority. But whether we can really get to the stage how to proceed with the so-called Chinese Commonwealth, I think maybe this is still a little bit far-fetched. Actually, I'm also curious about the concept of Chinese Commonwealth. As you know, the British Commonwealth and now called Commonwealth, it's a very loose association. So if you mean the Chinese Commonwealth is the relationship, for instance, between Singapore and the UK, or Singapore with China, then probably that will be more appealing, more attractive to the people in Taiwan. But again, you see, it's very difficult to define. So what the Chinese Commonwealth really will look like, whether that will be attractive, whether that will be supported, whether that will be accepted by the people in Taiwan. So I think this is still a question. We need to try to find some interpretations or some explanation. So how do you respond to this?
Let me put it in this way. That's a close economic connection between Taiwan and mainland China have been years. And of course, that gives us some foundation to move towards a Chinese Commonwealth or something similar. So of course, then I need a clearer description about the Chinese Commonwealth, what it might be, how it looks like. And, but I have to say, even such a proposition is not purely economical, because political decision is the most important thing. So other than explaining what the Chinese Commonwealth might be, I will also ask you to think about this. George says that the mainland China should not object this idea. And, but to my knowledge, I think this idea has been proposed before in different occasions. But to my knowledge, the mainland China government has never given any, they actually ignored this proposition, let alone given any positive response to it. So could this Chinese Commonwealth be a wishful thinking by us or by only a few people? I would like to hear some from Philip. Can you say, how do you think about 不管是邦联或者是国协, what's the ideal form that it may be, and also mainland China's attitude towards this?
I pretty much agree with Professor Guan's observation that in the past, though this idea has been proposed either through academic discussions or through some sort of second-track diplomacy, we have never heard any positive response from almost anybody of mainland China. I guess at least there are a number of practical obstacles to be overcome if we really want to enter into a stage of serious discussion about this by governments from both sides. The first is really the wide disparity in terms of comprehensive national power, economic size, so on and so forth, between Taiwan and China. And that's really something drastically different from what we've seen in many successful models of supranational integration, such as EU. So that's the first obstacle. The second is that as far as we know, Beijing's official canon about unification has been always focusing on a unitary state, rather than anything that would accommodate a formula like confederation or commonwealth. And this is related to the third obstacle. The third obstacle is that, taking EU as an example, such an integration model entails or permits the national representation in governmental international organization, which I think is pretty hard for Beijing to accept if Taiwan enjoys, for example, full membership in the UN. That's that takes a very strong political will on the part of Beijing. And I suspect even any leader, even though like a strong man like Xi Jinping, would be willing to do that, given the fact that China is facing currently mounting domestic challenges as well as external problems. Okay. The final one, I guess, is really about the sustainability of a model like Commonwealth or Confederation. Again, taking EU as an example, actually one of the most common or the most frequently mentioned problem of EU is the problem of so-called democratic deficits. That means that throughout the process of long-term integration, there has been a problem of various EU countries not paying sufficient attention to the need and demand or aspiration of grassroots citizens in their domestic context. Okay? So again, public opinion, for example, in Taiwan, is still very important, not only to initiate, but also to sustain such a supranational model of integration, such as Commonwealth or Confederation. So that's some of my observations.
Let me speak as a diplomat. When Gu Zhenfu, when he said, one China consensus, each side has its own interpretation. So he was very close to the period when the 92 consensus was set. And on that basis, he met Wan Taohan. China has said, on this basis of one China consensus, 什么都可以谈. 什么都可以谈. 什么都可以谈 includes the Commonwealth. So, you do not want to define too clearly what you want to do. But you can say, look, this is the 92 consensus. We at that time said to each his own interpretation. So I give my interpretation. You say anything can be discussed, so it includes this which I'm now putting on the table. Now, they can say, I don't want to discuss it. Eh? You say anything can be discussed. Now you don't want to discuss it. You have gone back on your word. So diplomatically, this is how I will make my initial moves. Don't say too much, but say, put it on the table first. And let it evolve, because they will begin to signal back what is possible, what is not possible. You will signal. Then you get to know each other. So earlier, Vice President Vincent Hsu talked about his first meeting with Li Lanqing in 1992, where I was honored to be present. And out of it grew a personal friendship which lasted a lifetime. So when people start talking and exploring, all kinds of personal friendships will grow. Li Lanqing told me in 2003, he launched the official history of the Qing dynasty. The official history of the Qing dynasty has not yet been written. There was one produced by Ming Guo, but it was not a good job. And he told the scholars, don't rush to a decision. And from 99 volumes, it became 250 volumes. I do not know when they'll complete it, because there's so much material in the Qing dynasty, including material about the Christian missions that went to China, including material about Taiwan. All that history will have to be written. Now, the moment we start talking about all these things, you'll say, oh yeah, we did this together. We fought the Japanese together. We helped each other. There was an earthquake in Nanao Island. The people came to southern Taiwan, and so on. Then slowly, trust will build up. Take our time, but begin by holding the PRC to its word. Anything can be discussed. So I want to discuss this. I said at the time, it's my interpretation. I interpret it this way. Let's begin from here. And slowly build up trust. We will not become like the EU. I think the initial process will be more like ASEAN. ASEAN, every country is sovereign. All over the world, we fly our national flag, we fly the ASEAN flag together. We promise that in any other country, if you need help and you don't have an embassy, any ASEAN embassy will help you. And more at international meetings at the UN, ASEAN countries clump together. We're getting closer and closer together. We have become ASEAN citizens. Now, I do not know between Taiwan and the mainland what will evolve, but we're not talking about the European model. ASEAN has no executive. It has a small secretariat, but the leaders meet very often. If you have one China consensus and you have, say, 2 meetings every year between the leaders of China and Taiwan, the way President Ma Ying-jeou met President Xi Jinping. They 2 meetings a year, and we discuss these things. And officials have to prepare papers and so on. That would be a huge advance. Is that possible? I think it's entirely possible.
Mr. Lin, also as a diplomat, how do you think that this is possible? I mean, if we really want to start some negotiation, it's truly that everything can be discussed. Even though Wang Daohan says under one China principle that everything can be discussed, but is this still possible in President Xi's period?
George, certainly it's a very nice way of putting this. But actually, one China policy or one China principle is something very difficult, especially under the interpretation of strategic ambiguity. We know that you have tried to make this work. So under one China principle, everything can be discussed, everything is possible. But in fact, whether we can really make some arrangement, that will be extremely difficult. How to get the process moving to the future about the concept of Chinese Commonwealth. You mentioned ASEAN. ASEAN can be a good example, but whether the ASEAN example can be applicable is in the so-called one China context. So this is very extremely difficult, I think, for the people in Taiwan. On the other hand, we have to realize that in Taiwan, there is no consensus. There is no national consensus regarding this issue. For the DPP, for the KMT, and for other parties, so we have different ideas about how to proceed in our relation with the PRC. So the Chinese Commonwealth concept certainly will need a lot of time to be dealt with, to be discussed, or to reach some kind of consensus.
Actually, I can just follow up this question because a Chinese Commonwealth, this proposition is kind of like one step forward from the 1992 consensus. And on one hand, any such Commonwealth will require certain governing mechanism. It cannot just be so primitive like the example in Iceland. So they need some formal institution to resolve various economic and political issues. And so it should not be surprising to reach an agreement on such a mechanism, such a governing mechanism, would be even more difficult to reach the 1992 consensus. On the other hand, that we all know that our current ruling party, DPP, and many Taiwanese people, they do not even accept the legitimacy of the 1992 consensus. So it's just hard for me to imagine that how Taiwanese can jump into even a more difficult Chinese Commonwealth, the discussion of this Chinese Commonwealth initiative. Can you say a little bit about this, George?
I'm very mindful that I should not interfere. I can only say, if you ask me, that's how I see the future. If every way is not possible except this way, then I say good luck, all the best. But I believe in the way, after paying a price, you will come back. And every time I look at Ukraine and lament the horrors that the people went through, only to find themselves back to more or less the first position, which they were at without a war, is such a tragedy. And of course, I don't live here, so it would not be my tragedy, but it would be very painful to watch what will happen.
I would say that we are really moving into some very difficult and dangerous times. From 1992 consensus to your proposal of a one China, one Chinese Commonwealth. I think that there will be a lot of things to be clarified. So maybe there can be some informal exchange between Taiwan and Singapore. We don't know how this can be started because Singapore is always a very special friend to Taiwan. We are very grateful to Singapore for facilitating, as you mentioned earlier, the Guoan Huitan and also the Maxi meeting in 2015. So maybe in that context, Singapore can really play a very important part to bridge the gap, to serve as a coordinator, trying to clarify the situation, trying to understand what is possible, what is not possible, including the idea of a Chinese Commonwealth. I'm not quite sure whether the PRC, whether mainland China can even agree to sit together to discuss this issue. Maybe through track 2 or through a third party, maybe something can be implemented, something we can push forward a little bit, step by step. But I think for the time being, maintaining the status quo of peace and stability for Taiwan's future development is still the top priority. And on that, we have much more national consensus. All political parties in Taiwan, the majority of Taiwanese people can support such an idea. So at the same time, we can wait maybe for some future time, we can proceed some other alternatives.
Let me be very brief. I want to make 2 points. The first is that I want to echo Minister Lin's previous point that even though any future leader or leaders in the next few years in Taiwan may not be really able to seriously discuss any model of unification with China under the agreement of the mainstream public opinion in Taiwan, but at least, as Mr. Lin has pointed out, that restoring a dialogue communication is of utmost importance to sort of rebuild the trust between Taipei and Beijing, or at least to ease up the suspicions or mutual distrust, which would easily lead to war and jeopardize stability. That's the first point. The second one is that we have to resolve this sort of a chicken and egg problem. On the one hand, the mainstream public opinion is increasingly distrustful of Beijing, let alone talking about unification because of the mounting coercive pressures from Beijing to coerce Taiwan into unification or negotiation. On the other hand, Beijing is also increasingly anxious in feeling that unification is had better be achieved sooner rather than later, because it feels that the U.S. support for Taiwan seems to be creating the effect of a so-called hollowing out Washington One China policy, which has actually aggravated tremendously since 2016. So we really have to resolve this chicken egg problem before we can seriously talk about any future model of integration. That's it.
I fully agree. President Ma actually proposed no independence, no unification, no use of force. Actually, that was a very important political foundation during that time. So we have also dealt with very smoothly with the United States and also with the PRC. So I think that is also part of the status quo we are trying to maintain. So we'll see what we can do for the future. At the same time, I also like to point out that the Taiwan issue or the cross-strait relationship is not only the relationship between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, but actually the future development, the further trend will be seriously affected by the strategic competition, by the great power relationship between the United States and China. And then, of course, we have to consider the geopolitical reality in a wider context, especially for the region. So I think Taiwan has a role to play in such a process, but we have to cooperate with our partners.
George mentioned is that the status quo, actually also including President Ma's 不独不统不武 is actually something not sustainable in the longer run. And so George, you still want to elaborate on this? We need to do something to move things forward.
The meeting between President Ma and President Xi in Singapore was a profound development. What did President Ma concede to have that meeting? 不独不武不统，就二共识。And they had a very good meeting. What did Xi Jinping concede? He did something which no other Chinese leader did, which was to recognize the leader of Taiwan as an equal. Each addressed the other as sanctum. This was a major move. 2015, Xi Jinping only became 总书记 in October 2022 and president in March 2023. He had just fought off Zhou Yongkang. He was still in a vulnerable position. He had not yet cleaned up the PLA. And he made this move at personal risk to himself. I think he paid a heavier price than President Ma to have that meeting. That meeting was very significant. Is it impossible to have regular summits between the leaders of China and Taiwan, each addressing the other as sanctum, with dignity, each paying half the bill, and can still meet in Singapore? It's okay. Singapore will be honored. This was what the leaders of Iceland and Switzerland did. They just met as equals and talk about common problems and say, okay, we meet again. Maybe initially you meet in Singapore, then after that you can alternate between Beijing and Taipei. And after that, some other lovely spots. You see? Little by little, trust will build. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. It's already been done. There's a precedent, there's a template.
I'm very glad you mentioned 不统不独不武. That was my idea when I was president, and now I retire. But my ideas do not retire. Why? Because our candidate, Hou Youyi, also want to succeed to that. 不统不独不武. See what I mean? Okay, go ahead. Oh, another thing is about the Commonwealth. In the 19th century, 20th century, there's British Commonwealth. Yeah, in the last century, we have the Russians Commonwealth of independent states. But I don't think we should follow their example, and we should develop our own model of development. Thank you.
2 minutes. But I still want to raise a question that lots of Taiwanese people concern, and I would like to get you some feedback from all 3 of our panelists. Is because we've been talking about different things about the Commonwealth, but more important question to Taiwanese people is that under this framework, how Taiwan could realistically maintain its identity in this proposed Commonwealth. This is, I think, is of particular concern to lots of Taiwanese people, and especially when mainland Chinese is and will still be the dominant economy and the military force. Then how can we still have our identity? How not just identity, but also our autonomy to a large extent. So, any one of you want to start first?
I think in Taiwan, opinion polls are still very important. National consensus is also important in order to reach any conclusion or any agreement to proceed with new initiatives. So I think this is the reality we have to face in a full-fledged democracy like Taiwan. So for the future, I think we also need such a process of moving forward to the proposal mentioned by George. So there's a long way to go, but we have to consider the top priority. So we are acting, we are doing now, right now. I think that is more important. So for a Chinese Commonwealth, or for other ideas, I think we can still wait. For the moment, we need to maintain peace and stability in order to step up, to accelerate Taiwan's further development, economic strength. I think that's important.
Professor Guan asked about maintaining Taiwan identity. Let me take the liberty of interpreting this question as maintaining both identity and autonomy. I guess at least three elements are probably consequential when we just focus on the model of Commonwealth. The first is to maintain Taiwan's autonomous force of national defense. The second is to maintain the political/legal system where the government Taipei enjoys the highest authority in terms of determining its internal affairs in legal and political spheres. And the final one is that Taiwan should be granted sufficient or adequate international space as a sovereign nation. That is consistent with the mainstream public Taiwan opinion, which is of course still pose very serious challenges, even though just want to create this model of confederation. Yes.
About the identity thing that the Taiwanese people worry about in any negotiation, any discussion, that Taiwanese worry about losing this identity.
Joe of ever losing his identity because of the circumstances of the history and the present. It's like an oyster which has something it cannot remove, which is stuck with, which is a political situation. But out of it, a pearl forms. So I look at Tzu Chi, I look at TSMC. Without that sand in the side of the pearl, of the oyster, TSMC and Tzu Chi could not have flourished. The key is, for the future, you must keep your talent. Because the bright people, they have options. Many Taiwanese have become Singaporeans. Why? They're afraid for the future. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, do they want their children to be in Taiwan? I think that is the single most important question. Do everything so that Taiwanese will remain in Taiwan and continue to grow that pearl. And the status quo by itself cannot achieve that.
Thank you very much. We will still have some time. We will open to the question from the Slido. But of course, I would like to say something also about the identity thing that lots of people worry about. Just like George just mentioned, Taiwan actually has its own identity in many different aspects. In George's speech, he repeatedly mentioned about Tzu Chi and some other religious groups. What those groups have done is kind of identity. And our semiconductor, our IT industry is some kind of identity. And we even say Lin Huaiming, the Yunmen, is also another identity. We do already have lots of identities we can be proud of. So while lots of people still worry about we are losing our identity in any negotiation process, I think we should be more confident about the identity that we already built in the past years. So now we will check what kind of question we have on the Slido.
You can scan the QR code on the screen to join the conversation. We have our first question from Thomas Hu. What can Taiwan learn from Singapore in striking a balance when choices of security alliance and political economic partnerships are in conflict?
Henry Kissinger describes Singapore in this way. He says the Singaporeans are cold-blooded in the analysis of the global situation. You cannot be subjective. We cannot change the world. We have to accept the world for what it is. We have to adjust to the world. And that's how we have survived. We are constantly re-triangulating our position. I was asked, if we are forced to a choice between the US and China, what would Singapore do? Again, I'm not reflecting Singapore government's position. This is my position. I said, well, if you ask me today, we'll support the US because we are a financial center. It's a US-controlled international financial system. Our military is heavily dependent on American weaponry. I was head of Air Force planning. I bought American equipment, American missiles. But if you ask me 20 years from now, which side will we jump if we are forced? I say, I'm not so sure. Because by that time, China will be a very huge economy and very much a part of the lives of all Southeast Asians. So the strategic environment changes all the time. And when you are small, you have to adjust to the environment. We cannot change the environment. We can change a little bit in ASEAN, maybe, but that's all. We have to accept the world for what it is and be very objective, very cold-blooded in how we analyze the situation. This goes back to Ping Fa, 知己知彼. This is very critical. The moment we are subjective, we are in danger.
I think certain strategic environments are probably suitable for that than in others. And whether or not Taiwan has this strategic environment, I guess, is a little bit questionable. Not only because of Taiwan's confrontation with China in both the sovereignty, over both the sovereignty and military security issues, but also because Taiwan's internal situation, where the mainstream public opinion is really not so trustful of China. And any sort of governmental friendship gestures or policy toward China may sometimes breed dire consequences domestically, which is of course not the case in Singapore at all. So I guess still hedging strategy is something that Taiwan can consider, but for as Mr. Yeo has pointed out, for any leader who has a really long-term vision or foresight, they have to change both internal and external strategic environment of Taiwan in order to pursue such a wiser and more well-deliberated policy. Thanks.
Actually, I have very high admiration for Singapore as a very important country in the region. Singapore has developed a very highly developed economy, the financial center in the region, now surpassing Hong Kong. Singapore has also maintained a very important military power, so as a deterrence, as a defense for itself. But more importantly, Singapore is in ASEAN. So the whole ASEAN, actually, the whole bloc has become more important. Together, it has already become the 5th largest economy in the world. So we can see that Singapore has been very successful in line with its own foreign policy and also the policy taken by ASEAN as a whole. So Singapore is not taking sides, it's not choosing a side between the United States and China. So I think this is a very wise policy move, whether Taiwan can also consider, can learn something from the Singaporean experience, given the fact that we are also torn now between the United States and the PRC in such strategic competition. So the great power relationship actually is here to stay. So I think that is why Kishore Mahbubani mentioned the other day that for the next few years, 10 years, 20 years, such competition, such great power relation will continue in the region, and then we have to be very cautious in order to cope with the situation. As George mentioned, a small country, we need to adapt, we need to adjust to the situation as it is folding.
The next question is from Wei Wu Lam. Other than offering tables and chairs, what else can Singapore do to promote dialogue between Taiwan and China?
Singapore leaders are very careful not to be too clever by offering advice to other people. So we can state our views, we can offer our goodwill. We should be peacemakers, never troublemakers. So if Taiwanese and mainland leaders want to meet in Singapore, of course we are very honored. We'll do everything to make it comfortable. When Trump and Kim Jong-un met in Singapore, I don't think they consulted Singapore beforehand. But of course we welcome them. I was the first foreign minister to visit Pyongyang, and we have very good relations with North Korea. And why not? Why not? So that's our position. Goodwill, because goodwill for others leads to peace, is good for Singapore. If the world is in turmoil, it's very bad for Singapore. If there's conflict between mainland and Taiwan, it's very bad for Singapore. When Pelosi visited Taiwan, even I know of no Singaporean who was happy with that visit. Even my friends who were anti-PRC were all very angry. And in Hong Kong, they stayed up late at night to follow what was happening, because it was not clear whether or not Pelosi was going to land in Taipei. You know, our wish is for there to be peace. If there's peace, we'll find many ways to work together to benefit ordinary people. In the end, in politics, what is our objective? It's to benefit the Lao Bai Sing. And if people have better lives, have more hope for their children, that must be a good thing. Creating tension, ideologies, big ideas, I'm very suspicious of them, because very often they only lead to evil.
This one is from Xu Hongquan. Do you think President Xi Jinping's stance is the same now as in 2015? And happy birthday, Mr. Yo.
His position has changed.
And how do you think about this? I want to mention this at the end of this session, but since this gentleman already mentioned, may I invite all the audience, we give a round of applause for George for his birthday. Now, in any event, there's always some surprise that we already planned a certain highlight, but just unfortunately it got, you know. So we still have like 1 minute or 2 minutes, so we can still see your question.
Another question from Xu Heqian. Will the new generation of Singaporean leaders be as passionate and politically delicate as your generation in facilitating the cross-strait dialogues?
We must never take for granted that an old position can be maintained without effort. It's very important for younger Singapore leaders and younger Taiwan leaders to continue to meet, to continue to develop deep friendships, to continue to rely upon each other, to continue to feel that if they need help, they can ask the other side for help. And I never expected that I'll need Taiwan to save my son. And in 2011, the first time we called on, you see, I could not visit Taiwan for 7 years as foreign minister. The night I lost the elections, I told myself, I'm coming to Taiwan. Because this thing has weighed upon me that we have not expressed gratitude to Zheng Yan, Xiang Ren, and the donor, Huang Qichuan Xinsheng. So we came here. And then I called on President Ma, I called on Vice President Lin Zhan, Vice President Vincent Hsu, and others. And I proudly say, my son is Taiwanese by blood. He is, because his blood is not mine. His blood is that of a Taiwanese. So I never doubted that I could get this assistance from Taiwan. And Taiwanese should feel the same about Singapore. And that is the depth of a relationship, and it should continue into the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, our time is up for this session, and at the end, I would like to thank Judge and Mr. Lin and Professor Xu for participating in this panel discussion. I was the moderator, but didn't get any chance to say anything. So I would like to take the advantages to say a few words. Even though I raised a bunch of questions for George and the other panelists, in fact, I have to say that I agree to a large extent of what George mentioned. Especially, I think the cross-strait relation, of course, is crucial for us. It's not crucial for George. But George spoke as a relative, suggested what we need to move forward because we need to find a better future for Taiwan. He didn't want to see Taiwan involuntarily pushed into a war. So my personal opinion is that, and also a reason why we started this forum, this will not be the only forum, but we're going to have more in the coming days. But I do hope that more and more people are willing to consider in a different way, rather than get stuck in the conventional views on the cross-strait relations. Like George mentioned, that a leader needs the courage to look forward with vision and with the courage to take actions. I think this is important. This is also what I expect our current 总统候选人们, they will have such a courage to speak out their attitude clearly, loud and clear about his attitude towards the cross-strait relation and what kind of action he will take if he could be elected. And I hope this forum has brought you some idea and give you some chance to think about the cross-strait relation in the future. Let me once again thank George and the panelists and all the distinguished guests for coming to this event. Thank you very much.